The leaders of China and Russia are hailing a new era in relations following a second day of talks in Moscow. Just a short time ago, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin signed a deal to expand bilateral trade and energy ties, giving Vladimir Putin what Western sanctions are designed to deny him of: cash to fund his war in Ukraine.
Trying to put on the most reassuring smiles, Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin pledged to strengthen ties. Putin, increasingly isolated by the West for his invasion of Ukraine, is forced to turn east for a friendly handshake.
On the issue of the Ukrainian crisis, China has always adhered to the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter, adhered to an objective and impartial position, and actively promoted peace and negotiations.
Beijing's refusal to condemn the war on Ukraine has been the driving force of this friendship. Instead, Xi has proposed a so-called peace plan, handing his counterpart the opportunity to blame the West and Ukraine.
We believe that many of the provisions in the peace plan put forward by China are consistent with Russian approaches and can be taken as the basis for a peaceful settlement when they are ready for it in the West and in Kyiv. However, so far we have not seen such readiness on their part.
For Putin, an alliance with Xi also offers a chance to close the gap left by the withdrawal of Western firms from Russia following its war on Ukraine.
We are ready to support Chinese businesses when it comes to replacing the production of the Western enterprises that have left Russia.
Boasting a number of new deals on energy and trade, the autocratic duo promise a new era of partnership, one where China sees itself as a peace broker for Russia and Ukraine.
Well, I'm joined now by Nico Langa. He is a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference, an expert on Russia and Ukraine. He joins me tonight from London. It's good to have you on the program. Let me just ask you, what did we see today? We saw all of these agreements being signed, and there are claims that China and Russia have become closer than ever before. Is that what you're seeing?
No, let's be honest here. This is no partnership on eye level. They really seem to need it if they have to ostensibly underline their friendship many, many times. But I think what we really see is China is buying Russian energy cheaply, and China is promoting a plan that is not a peace plan because it does not contain the information that Russia leaves the territory of Ukraine. And if we talk about trade increasing, it's in fact Russian raw materials and Russian resources selling out cheaply to a much stronger China.
And also, China, with these agreements, is agreeing to buy more Russian energy. That funds the Russian war machine, doesn't it? And so China, after today, basically is agreeing to co-finance the war in Ukraine. Is that an accurate assumption?
I think this has been true before disagreements, but yes, China is financing the war of Russia against Ukraine, which means that Xi Jinping was not saying the truth when he said that China is on the side of the Charter of the United Nations. In fact, it isn't.
So then, considering all of that, what do you think Xi Jinping's end game is here? I mean, does he want to see this conflict in Ukraine continue and to fester? I mean, what's in it for him?
Yeah, for him, I think he is using the weak position Putin maneuvered himself into by getting cheap resources for the Chinese economy, because Russia has no other option than to sell cheaply to China. And at the same time, I think Xi Jinping is trying to balance between more covert support for Russia and at the same time not to be seen to openly support Russia's war because he is afraid of stronger sanctions from the West. So it's a delicate line of balance, I think, for Xi. But at the same time, at the same time, the main point has not been solved neither today or yesterday, because peace is very easy to achieve. Russia leaves Ukraine and then we have peace. And China unfortunately, was not pushing for that.
No, and we've had a lot of analysts who have said that maybe there is the possibility that we could move closer to peace with China, perhaps as a peace broker. And they were also pointing to what we saw recently, and that is this new agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to recognize each other diplomatically. Has that all been wishful thinking?
Yes, it has been. I think it was an illusion to believe that China could play a constructive role here in an organization of peace. China is just following its own egoistic interests. It's not a friend of Russia, but I think they are united in the idea that they are working against the West and the United States. So that brings them together. But I think we cannot hope for China bringing peace to Ukraine. If China would want that, it could push Russia to leave to move the Russian forces out of Ukraine.
And what about Europe looking at all of this? I mean, we've got a war in the middle of Europe right now, and much of the European Union obviously supporting Ukraine, but at the same time has incredibly important economic ties with China. Is this dichotomy, is it an advantage for Xi Jinping?
I would think we should not overestimate the pictures we saw yesterday and today. I think Putin is very proud that after his arrest warrant by the ICC, that he now has an international visitor, an important one who stays for 3 days. There's a lot of symbolism in that. But I think the fact is Putin's war is not going well, which is a problem for him, but also a problem for China. So China is trying to make profit out of it and maybe to stabilize Putin, because China wants to have stability on its northern borders that it has with Russia. But we should not really overestimate this visit. This is not really changing the game. If we support Ukraine further, I think Ukraine has a good chance to liberate its territories, and that's the only way that will bring peace.
And final question for you, Mr. Lange. The fact, though, that Xi Jinping is visiting Vladimir Putin right now, a week after Vladimir Putin, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for war crimes. They say you're judged by the company you keep, and apparently Xi Jinping doesn't care what people think about Mr. Putin.
No, we have known before that China wants to change the international order. It wants to change the rules that we have developed after the Second World War. And I think this visit just confirms it. China is not adhering to the international law as we know it. And I think we should take that very seriously, that Xi Jinping proceeded with this visit and even stayed for 3 days with an alleged war criminal or with somebody who is even out with an arrest warrant from ICC.
Yeah, you have to wonder what he'll write on his postcard. Mr. Lange, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now here at the big table is our chief international editor, Richard Walker. Richard, let's start with the war in Ukraine. I mean, I said at the top of the show, China's position on Ukraine unchanged.
Yeah, and of course we're seeing a little bit of sort of fleshing out with signals from what we're seeing in the statement and what they've said in the televised comments here to give us a fuller kind of picture of what China really means by this plan, because there's been a lot of questions about it. It came out a few weeks ago, a lot of curiosity about what exactly is China doing here. What have we learned from this? I mean, I think, first of all, Vladimir Putin said in his comments that essentially that he's open to following China's approach, that it can work with these kind of principles that China has drawn up. Putin can't really say much else than that, of course. I mean, he can't say, no, of course, we're not going with any of this. China very much the senior partner in this relationship, so Putin kind of has to do that. But if we look at what China is saying, and China is allowing to be said in their concluding statements, China says that it's neutral in this, but rhetorically, it's really very closely aligned with the Russian position. And if you look at the statement that they put out, there's a lot of talk about kind of bloc confrontation, basically putting the blame on NATO for this conflict. Long passages complaining about NATO not just in Europe, but also complaining about kind of Western military sort of alliance building in Asia. So kind of like this alignment of kind of views of the state of the world and the United States kind of leading opposition against these two countries. And there's one quote that I want to read to you, Brent, from this statement, because it really is quite something to see this statement. So this is in translation. About the Ukraine war, the parties call for an end to all steps that contribute to the escalation of tensions and prolonged hostilities. The parties. Now,
what does that mean?
But that sounds like something. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine.
Exactly.
Russia is trying to, take Ukraine pretty much off the map. For it to sign a statement saying that the parties call for an end to all steps that contribute to the escalation, I mean, I think this will be seen as cynical to the point of laughable by many.
And China also has to know that it is helping to finance this war with these agreements that were signed today that give China and Russia closer economic ties. I mean, someone has to buy Russia's oil and gas, right? And that's going to be China.
Yeah, I mean, so of course, Russia has lost Europe pretty much as a market for oil and gas. Russia is looking around for new customers for that. With oil, it's not that difficult. You just put oil on a tanker and it can go somewhere else. With gas, it can be quite complicated. This is quite interesting also in terms of the messaging here. So there's been a lot of speculation about whether the two sides would announce that they've agreed on opening up a new gas pipeline from Russia to China, passing through Mongolian territory. Vladimir Putin, in his televised remarks, said, we've pretty much done it, it's pretty much a done deal. But when you look at the statement there, it's not quite as confirmed. Now, this pipeline is very important to Russia. It needs to be able to sell this gas that it can no longer sell to Europe. I think it's quite interesting that is not as much of a done deal, evidently, as Putin is saying. I think that sort of also points to the fact of the inequality in this relationship. He needs it more than the Chinese side.
Yeah, very good point. Richard Walker, as always, we appreciate your analysis. Thank you. Well, for more now, I'm joined by Joshua Kurlantic. He's a senior fellow for Southeast Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He's also author of the book, Beijing's Global Media Offensive. It looks at how Beijing is trying to become a media information superpower and wield influence around the world. It's good to have you on the program. I want to start with what we are seeing right now in Moscow. When you see these two presidents, the Chinese president, the Russian president, standing side by side, what do you see?
Well, I mean, I see that Xi Jinping has more clearly chosen to collaborate with Vladimir Putin, who I think he has a fairly high degree of suspicion of, and is not exactly thrilled by the way Putin has gone about a lot of his actions, but feels no choice other than to build a closer relationship, given both Xi's increasing authoritarianism and the increasingly complex and difficult confrontation between basically liberal democratic states and China.
I know that when we look at Xi Jinping, we see him as the leader of an economic power, the leader of an ascending military power. Are we limiting our perception of China, though? I mean, are we doing that also to our own detriment by only seeing an economic and military superpower here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what we're limiting that in that China's become increasingly influential in their global media. Nearly all the Chinese language media in the world now is controlled by Beijing. You're limiting and seeing the growing power of China's social media platforms. Most importantly, TikTok, which, although is a pseudo-private company, there's a seat on the board of the Chinese government, and it isn't really a private company. I think you're missing the increasingly powerful influence of China within other countries' societies and politics. There's a scandal going on right now in Canada of possible Chinese intervention in Canadian federal elections. There's been Chinese intervention in politics in Australia, New Zealand, significant interventions in Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and to some extent the U.S.
We recently saw China broker a return to diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Talk to me about China's increasing soft power.
Well, I mean, I think that's more like traditional diplomacy, but soft power comes from other countries being attracted to your ideas or your culture, etc. I actually don't think China has an enormous store of soft power. China's actually image in much of the world is not great, but in some places like the Middle East, Africa, and some other developing regions, the image is still fairly good. But China wants to build up greater soft power because soft power popularity among publics and elites in countries makes it easier for you to achieve that milestone.
You have been quoted as saying that China's disinformation efforts, though becoming more sophisticated, still remain fairly clumsy in much of the world compared to those of Russia. Is Vladimir Putin, is he schooling Xi Jinping in how to be a successful disseminator of disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Russian government, not necessarily Vladimir Putin, has been teaching China more effective types of disinformation. China's disinformation has so far on most social media platforms been fairly clumsy in Taiwan, in parts of Southeast Asia and Australia and other places, where compared to Russian disinformation, which has been much more skillful, particularly at figuring out organic divides, natural divides within other countries' societies, and then playing those up. So I think we will see a future of China using more successful disinformation, some of it probably learned from Russia.
And considering all this, where does Ukraine fit into Xi Jinping's thinking?
Well, I think that Xi Jinping, although he refused to work with the U.S. to try to convince Putin not to do this before it, I suspect that he, like a lot of people, didn't really believe Putin was going to do this. And I think that China is a little bit stuck. On the one hand, I think that they have to stand by Putin. Putin is their most important partner in so many ways in UN organizations, in sort of just a global pushback against liberal democracy and in many other ways. On the other hand, I don't really think they're thrilled by the war in Ukraine. It's so far hasn't been that successful for Russia. I'm not sure about the effect on Taiwan, but it definitely shows that you start a war and you don't know what's going to happen, which isn't necessarily what Xi Jinping wants to think right now. China's support has poisoned its relationships with a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which used to have very warm relations with China. I mean, some still do at the top levels, like Hungary, where Viktor Orban is still pretty warm with China. But most of the Central and Eastern European countries, which had pretty warm relations with China, have now turned against China. And that's almost exclusively because of the support for the Ukraine war. It's hurt China's image in a lot of other places too. I don't think Xi Jinping, I think in a perfect world, Xi Jinping would have preferred that Putin definitely not do this. But at this point, he has no choice but to stand by. The question will be whether you see something beyond China's still fairly cautious approach and some, if the war drags out, and some much more aggressive approach, like a massive supply of arms. I'll be very shocked to see that.
Joshua Kurlantic, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Excellent analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Xi Jinping is not the only major Asian leader with a stake in the war in Ukraine. Today, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida paid a visit unannounced to Kyiv to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Kishida has been a firm supporter of Ukraine, his country providing billions of dollars of humanitarian and financial aid to Kyiv. Japan has also joined the sanctions regime against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. Kishida invited Zelenskyy to address the G7 summit Japan is hosting in the city of Hiroshima this coming May. I'm joined now by Christopher Johnstone. He's a senior advisor and Japan chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Johnstone, it's good to have you on the program. We've got two major leaders from Asia, one in Russia, one in Ukraine. What does that tell you about how much Asia and the Ukraine war are now connected?
Yeah, we really have before us a tale of two visits. On the one hand, as your last segment really portrayed so well, President Xi visiting Moscow, offering really material and political support to the war in Ukraine on the one hand. And then on the other, Prime Minister Kishida, who before coming to Ukraine was in India, where he announced a broad vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific and a large package to go along and support it, and is now, as you said, in Kyiv, where he's been a real leader. In contrast to previous Japanese leaders, Prime Minister Kishida from the beginning sided strongly with the other members of the G7 in imposing sanctions on Russia, on Putin's regime, and in supporting Ukraine. And in so doing, he really departed from years, literally years of Japanese foreign policy, which had sought to cultivate closer ties with Russia. So it's striking to see the contrasting position that Prime Minister Kishida has taken, and it really does speak to the linkages that he sees between Europe and East Asia.
You know, we've reported many times that the leader of China looks at the war in Ukraine with, one eye on the situation in Taiwan. Is that the same when we're talking about Japan and its concerns about security in the Indo-Pacific region?
Absolutely. You could make the case that no country in Asia has been more influenced by the war in Ukraine than Japan. It has been Kishida from the beginning who has sought to draw connections between this use of force to alter the status quo, to achieve political aims that we've seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the possibility that China might attempt the same in East Asia. It was Prime Minister Kishida who coined that famous phrase that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. The sense that the international rules-based order is indivisible and that threats to it anywhere have to be responded to everywhere. That has been his frame in this. And in so doing, I might add, he's really brought other countries in Asia along with him. I would argue that in some ways it was the speed of Japan's response to the invasion that helped to make the response global. And after Japan weighed in so forcefully, South Korea came along, Singapore came along, of course, Australia was there early as well. So I really do think he's played an important role in sort of fostering a global response and helping the world understand the linkages between Asia and Europe.
These changes that you speak of for Japan, the war in Ukraine, it has forced some serious paradigm shifts to take place, particularly here in Germany. And that's the same in Japan. I'm wondering, has it been discussed and reported in public a lot? I mean, here in Germany, people have talked a lot about how this country, in the span of a year, how its foreign policy has been turned upside down. Is that the same in Japan?
It's absolutely the same in Japan. I mean, the coverage of the Ukraine war, I would argue in some ways is even more thorough and extensive than what we see in the United States. And it really has had a transformative effect on public opinion. I mean, when you think about the security environment in East Asia, right, North Korea has been launching missiles and testing nuclear devices for a long time. China's military modernization story is not new. It's a 2-decade story of really transformative investment in the military. So what's changed? Well, what changed is the war in Ukraine and the recognition on the part of the Japanese people that major war is possible in the 21st century, as shocking as that may be. And it's sparked real change. So this is a country that for 50 years had a policy of restraining defense spending to 1% of GDP. And on a single day in December, they cast that norm out the window and have embarked on a path to spending up to 2% of GDP, acquiring new capabilities, including long-range strike missiles, things that they've never had before in the entirety of the post-World War II period. So it really has had a profound impact on political discourse here, and I think made the Japanese public realize that Japan needs to do more to defend itself.
And I'd like to ask you before we run out of time, last week we did a lot of reporting on the AUKUS deal between the UK, Australia, and the US for nuclear technology submarines. And now we're talking about Japan and it spending on its military, a paradigm shift. All of these things come together and they lead to this question, will we see a military confrontation between the US and China in this decade, perhaps? We know some US generals have said we will. What's your opinion?
I don't think a conflict is inevitable by any means. I don't. I think we are in a dangerous period. It's clear that Xi Jinping has given his military the order to be ready by 2027, but that's different from an order to go by 2027. So I'm a firm believer that deterrence remains possible. And that's why these steps that we've seen with Japan, investing in its own defense, Australia, as you said, with the AUKUS deal, investments that we see Korea making, even progress in the relationship of the United States with the Philippines. All of these things, I think, send a message that the web of like-minded states, the web of U.S. alliances and partners in the region is drawing tighter. And that's a good thing for deterrence. I do think we can avoid the worst outcome here.
Mr. Johnson, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Our correspondent, Nick Connolly, he is standing by in Kyiv. Nick, it's good to see you. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, held, in their words, very constructive talks, but we have to remind ourselves that Xi is not coming to Kyiv for talks with the Ukrainian president, is he?
Well, not only that, but it also seems, if a comment by President Zelenskyy today is anything to go by, that there isn't even a date or a timing yet for this promised phone call between the Ukrainian leader and his Chinese counterpart. So even the kind of compensation, the prize, is not necessarily a done deal. I think it's not much of a surprise for Ukrainian politicians that the Chinese leader wasn't going to come here to a country that is at war. All through this war, China's been helping Russia, has been helping Russia to get around Western sanctions, has been buying up all that Russian energy that's no longer going to Europe. But I think they're really worried that this could mark a change in the kind of quality of the relationship between Beijing and Moscow, and that we could actually see Chinese-made weapons making their way to the front lines here. So far, it's been more about chips, maybe some drones, but nothing on a large scale. And China is, after all, basically the only country with the resources and the kind of breadth to really make a huge difference to Russia's ability to produce weapons and keep on fighting here in Ukraine.
And Ukraine had another high-profile guest today, an unannounced one, in fact, and that was Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. What do you make of the timing of this visit? Two major visitor or leaders from Asia visiting, one Russia, the other Ukraine.
Well, obviously, a lot has been made of that. Lots of pundits convinced that this is something that was specially organized to coincide with that Chinese visit to Moscow. Has to be said, though, there are lots of caveats. These things take a lot of time. Coming to Kyiv nowadays is not the same as getting on a plane to Moscow. You have to get on a train. There's lots of security considerations. So a little bit of skepticism there whether this was actually possible to kind of make that happen on demand. But certainly there is a sense that Japan has upped its defense spending since the beginning of this war, is moving away from its more traditional kind of pacifist stance, and has sent a lot of money to Ukraine for rebuilding, helped Ukraine to work its energy systems after all those Russian attacks on the electricity grid here. But it has to be said that this is not a visit that is comparable to the one we've seen in Moscow. Japan just doesn't have the weapons, the weapons building capacity that even, say, South Korea has that could really help Ukraine. But I think it's become just a kind of symptom of the fact that this Ukraine war is now so important globally that everyone feels the need, earlier or later, to arrive here in Kyiv, to get on that train and to meet Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Yeah, the dividing lines right now, geopolitical dividing lines becoming clearer and clearer in Ukraine, that is for sure. Nick Connolly in Kyiv tonight. Nick, thank you.